My name is Chloe Harper, I'm 27, and I taught 11 third graders how to read chapter books this year. Every single one of them, even the boy the district said would never test above a second grade level. That achievement meant nothing in courtroom 4B. I sat at the plaintiff's table in the same navy blazer I wore to parent-teacher conferences, my hands folded so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. Nathan Brooks sat beside me, calm as a man reading a menu, while across the aisle, my mother arranged herself like she was posing for a real estate listing, which, in a way, she was. Linda Harper had built a career convincing strangers that a house was worth more than it was. Today, the house was me, and she was telling the court I wasn't worth anything at all. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice carried that practiced warmth she used on clients before she pulled the rug out from under them. "My daughter is a wonderful person. She truly is, but she's only here because she wants money she never earned." The gallery, mostly my father's old business associates, a few nosy neighbors, and my brother's law firm colleagues who'd come to watch the show, made a sound, not quite a gasp, more like a exhale that agreed with her. I felt my jaw tighten, not my chest, not my throat, my jaw, a small muscle clenching below my ear until it ached. I had spent 18 years learning to control that muscle, learning to sit through Thanksgiving dinners where Ryan's promotions were toasted with champagne and my report cards were acknowledged with a nod. Learning that in the Harper family, love was allocated the way Linda allocated square footage, to whatever added value to the listing. Ryan didn't look at me. He sat 3 rows back in his charcoal Brooks Brothers suit, the same one he wore to close a 9-figure acquisition last spring, and he stared at a spot on the wall like he was already composing the apology he'd give his golf buddies for having a sister who did this. "I want to tell you something before we go further, because I think you'll understand it if you've ever sat at a table where everyone else's chair was worth more than yours. I didn't come here for the money. I came here because at some point in the last year, I stopped being able to do the math the way they wanted me to do it. If you've ever felt like you were just a line item to your own family, like your worth got tallied up and rounded down to 0 every single year, drop a comment. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why I stopped rounding." Judge Amelia Foster peered over her glasses at my mother, unmoved by the performance. She had the face of a woman who'd watched 1,000 Lindas try this exact tone in her courtroom, and none of them had ever worked. "Miss Harper," she said, meaning my mother since we shared the name, "you'll have your opportunity to speak. Right now, I'd like to hear from the petitioner's counsel." Nathan rose. He buttoned his jacket the way lawyers do when they want a jury, or in this case, a judge, to feel the weight of what's coming. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was the thing about Nathan Brooks that had made me trust him from our very first meeting. He didn't need volume because he built his cases out of paper, and paper doesn't need to shout to be true. "Your Honor," he said, 18 years ago, James Harper drafted an estate plan that named his daughter, Chloe, as the future controlling owner of Harper Construction Group. That plan was never entered into this court's probate record. Linda's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. I'd spent 27 years learning to read that woman's face across dinner tables and parent-teacher nights she skipped. And I knew that flicker. It was the look she got right before a deal fell through, and she needed, urgently, to control the room. "That's absurd," she said. "There's no such document. My husband made his wishes very clear before he passed, and this court already has the complete record." "We believe," Nathan said, and here he reached down and set a single sealed manila envelope on the evidence table, the paper edges crisp despite whatever archive it had been buried in for nearly 2 decades, "that the complete record was never allowed to reach this court." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something shifts beneath the surface. Not loud, not dramatic, just a stillness that tells you everyone in the space has suddenly recalculated what they thought they knew. Ryan finally looked at me, For the first time since I'd filed the petition 6 months earlier, my brother actually looked at me, and I watched his confidence do something I had never once seen it do in his entire adult life. It faltered. Let me back up, because you should understand the arithmetic before you understand the envelope. I grew up watching my mother sort people into categories the way she sorted listings: assets, liabilities, and staging props. My father, James Harper, built a construction company out of a single pickup truck and a business loan he almost didn't get approved for. By the time I was born, Harper Construction Group had 400 employees and a headquarters with his name etched into the lobby granite. By the time I was in middle school, my mother had learned exactly how much that name was worth and exactly how to attach herself to it. Ryan was born knowing how to be an asset. He was sharp, magnetic, the kind of kid teachers wrote "natural leader" on report cards for even when he hadn't led anything. My mother invested in him the way she invested in a fixer-upper with good bones, tutors, connections, a corner office waiting for him the moment he passed the bar. I was a liability from the start. Quiet, more interested in the stray cat behind our house than in the golf outings where my father did business. I didn't glow in a room the way Ryan did. I didn't add value to the listing. But here's the thing, nobody in my family understood, because none of them had ever had to learn it the way I did, standing in front of 30 overworked, underpaid public school teachers at every district training I ever attended. Value isn't always visible in the room. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in an archive, in a sealed envelope, waiting 18 years for someone patient enough to go looking for it. My father used to visit my classroom every September, before he got sick. He'd stand in the doorway in his work boots, take off his hard hat, and watch me teach for exactly 4 minutes before he had to leave for a site inspection. He never told my mother he did that. I only found out how often, years later, when one of my former students' mothers mentioned running into the nice man in the yellow hat. Outside my classroom more times than I could count. He saw something in that room that my mother never once looked for. I remember one visit specifically, because it was the last one before the diagnosis changed everything. It was raining, the kind of gray October rain that makes classrooms smell like wet raincoats and pencil shavings, and I was helping a boy named Marcus sound out the word mountain for the 3rd time that week. My father stood in the doorway, with water still dripping off the brim of his hard hat, and he didn't say a word. He just watched Marcus's face when the syllables finally clicked into place. The way his whole body seemed to unclench, like he'd been carrying something heavy and someone had finally taken it from him. Afterward, in the parking lot, my father hugged me the way he never did at home, tight and a little too long, and he said, "You built that. Nobody handed him that word. You built it, brick by brick, the same as I built the company." I didn't understand then why his voice cracked on the word company. I understand it perfectly now. 3 months later, he was diagnosed with the illness that would take him within the year, and the visit stopped. My mother took over his calendar, his appointments, his correspondence. She said it was to protect him from stress, and at the time, I believed her, because believing her had always been easier than the alternative. It never occurred to me that protecting my father might have meant something closer to controlling access to him. It never occurred to me that the last conversations he had, the ones that mattered most, might have happened without a single witness my mother didn't personally approve. I sat with him twice during those final months. Twice in 11 weeks, while Ryan visited nearly every weekend with his fiancée and his golf clubs, and his easy laugh that made my father's hospital room feel less like a hospital room. I told myself it was because I had a classroom full of 8-year-olds who needed me, and that was partly true. But some nights, lying awake in my apartment grading spelling tests, I wondered if some part of me had already accepted the arithmetic my mother had been teaching me since childhood, that my presence simply mattered less. I didn't know, sitting in that plastic hospital chair for the second and final time, that my father had already met privately with an estate attorney 3 weeks earlier. I didn't know he'd asked that attorney a question that would take me 18 years to hear the answer to. Which one of my children actually sees me, and not just what I've built? I found that question, word for word, in a letter I would not read until much, much later than I should have. The arithmetic didn't stop after he died. If anything, it accelerated. At the reading of what everyone believed was the complete will, 6 weeks after the funeral, I sat in a leather chair in a downtown law office while a different attorney, not Nathan, not yet, read through asset distributions that gave Ryan a 40% ownership stake in Harper Construction Group, gave my mother controlling interest and the family home outright, and gave me a modest trust fund earmarked, specifically, for educational purposes. $12,000. I remember doing the math in my head, right there in that chair, dividing $12,000 by the 18 years I'd been his daughter, and coming up with a number so small it made my eyes sting. Ryan hugged me afterward in the hallway. Genuinely, I think. My brother has never been cruel, only oblivious, which is sometimes its own kind of cruelty. And he said, "Dad probably figured you didn't need much. Teachers don't really need capital, right?" He meant it as a comfort. It landed like a diagnosis. My mother didn't hug me. She adjusted the collar of my blazer, the way she used to before school pictures, and said, "Your father always did things his own way. We just have to respect that now." At the time, I heard resignation in her voice. Looking back from this courtroom, in this navy blazer, I hear something else entirely. I hear relief. For 18 years, I built a quiet, ordinary life around that $12,000 arithmetic. I got my teaching certificate. I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 11 miles from the house I grew up in, close enough to visit for holidays, far enough that I stopped expecting to be asked. I watched Ryan's stake in the company multiply as Harper Construction Group grew, watched my mother's real estate portfolio grow alongside it, watched the two of them appear in the local business journal together at a gala for the company's 30th anniversary, my father's name on the building behind them, my absence in the photograph unremarked upon by anyone but me. I told myself for a long time that this was simply what my father had wanted. That somewhere in the version of him I carried, the version who watched Marcus sound out Mountain and hugged me too tight in a rainy parking lot, there was also a version who had looked at his quiet daughter and decided she needed less. I built an entire piece around that story because the alternative, that someone had built the story for me, was too enormous to carry alone. Then, 4 months ago, a woman named Eleanor Voss, a retired probate clerk with silver hair and hands that shook slightly from Parkinson's, mailed me a letter with no return address. Inside was a single index card, handwritten, listing a case number and 11 words. "There's a file connected to your father's estate. It never should have disappeared." I sat at my kitchen table for 40 minutes before I called Nathan Brooks. Back in courtroom 4B, Nathan reached for the envelope's seal, and Linda's attorney, a sharp, overpriced man named Alderman, who billed my mother by the quarter hour, stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is attempting to introduce undisclosed evidence." This document was recovered 11 days ago from the county's off-site archive facility, Nathan said, unbothered. Following a formal records request, opposing counsel was notified within 24 hours, per the disclosure schedule filed with this court. Judge Foster studied the filing stamp on Nathan's copy for a long moment, then looked at Alderman over the top of her glasses in a way that made the man visibly reconsider standing at all. "Overruled. Sit down, counsel." I watched my mother's hands. She'd folded them on the table exactly the way she taught me to fold mine for family photos, poised, camera ready, controlled. But her thumb was moving now, a small, involuntary circle against her own knuckle, the kind of motion I'd only ever seen her make once before, the week the county reassessed our old house, and the number came back lower than she'd told everyone at the club. She was doing math. I could see it happening behind her eyes. The same fast, cold calculation she did with every property that was about to lose her money. And for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't the variable she was trying to minimize. I was the one holding the number she couldn't control. Nathan broke the seal. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like when 18 years of silence finally gets opened in a room full of people who thought they already knew the ending, it sounds like paper. Just paper, sliding out of an envelope, impossibly quiet for something about to detonate everything my mother had spent 2 decades building. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. I already knew, in the marrow-deep way you know a truth before you've technically confirmed it, that the version of my life my mother had sold me for 27 years was about to be revealed as exactly what it always was: a staged listing. And underneath the staging, the real foundation, the one my father actually built for me, had been waiting, patiently, for someone to finally go looking underneath the paint. Nathan Brooks's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, and I remember thinking, the first time I sat across from his scarred oak desk, that it was the first room I'd been in for years that didn't smell like my mother's staged listings. No vanilla candles, no fresh paint masking older damage underneath. "Eleanor Voss doesn't send letters like this," he said, turning the index card over in his hands, studying the shaky handwriting like it was a fingerprint. "I've worked probate cases in this county for 16 years. She's meticulous. If she says a file disappeared, a file disappeared." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We start with what should exist and doesn't." He slid a legal pad across the desk toward me. "Every estate this size generates a paper trail: filing receipts, attorney correspondence, notarization logs, courthouse date stamps. If your father made changes to his estate plan that never reached probate, somewhere there's a gap. Gaps leave fingerprints." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad of my own, writing down every memory I had of my father's final year, every visitor, every appointment, every unexplained absence from his own calendar, while my apartment radiator ticked and cooled in the November cold. I want you to understand something about that night, because it's the night everything actually started. Not the courtroom, not the envelope. It started at a kitchen table with a cracked mug of cold tea and 18 years of quiet, finally deciding it was done being quiet. If you've ever spent a sleepless night rebuilding a puzzle nobody else believed was missing pieces, you already know what that kind of exhaustion feels like. It isn't tired, it's electric. For the next 4 months, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was the same Chloe Harper my 3rd graders knew, the one who kept a jar of pretzels in her desk drawer for kids who came to school hungry, who stayed 40 minutes late every Tuesday to run a reading club for 6 students. The district said were at risk, who smiled through parent-teacher conferences with mothers who had no idea their daughter's teacher was quietly assembling a case against her own family. I graded spelling tests. I laminated word walls. I broke up a shoving match over a stolen eraser and mediated it with the same patience I would later need in a courtroom I hadn't yet imagined sitting in. By night, I became someone else entirely. I learned to read courthouse indexing systems the way I'd once learned phonics. Slowly, then all at once. Nathan taught me how probate files were cataloged by case number, how notarization logs cross-referenced with attorney billing records, how a document that had been formally filed left a trail even if the document itself vanished. I spent Thursday evenings in the County Records Annex, a low beige building with fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects, sitting at a microfiche machine that smelled faintly of machine oil, scrolling through 18-year-old filing logs until my eyes burned and the numbers blurred into static. I found the first crack in October in a stack of attorney correspondence logs from the firm my father had used for his original estate plan. A single line dated 14 months before his death. Client requested amendment consultation. Trust restructuring, scheduled March 14th. I checked it against the will that had been read to us in that leather chair. There was no amendment reflected anywhere in that document. None. My hands were shaking when I photographed the log with my phone. Not from fear, from the particular electric vindication of finally holding a fact instead of a feeling. I called Nathan from the parking lot, sitting in my car with the engine off, breath fogging in the cold. "There's a meeting," I told him. "March 14th, trust restructuring. It's not in the will." There was a pause on the line, the kind Nathan only allowed himself when something mattered. "Chloe," he said, "that's not a gap anymore. That's a thread. Now, we pull it. Here's the part nobody tells you about gathering evidence against your own family. It doesn't feel like revenge while you're doing it. It feels like grief, wearing a different coat. Every document I found wasn't just proof. It was a small, precise correction to 18 years of a story I'd let other people write for me. Every filing stamp, every notarization date, every attorney's initials in the margin of some forgotten log was a sentence in a version of my father I'd been told didn't exist. A version who had, apparently, spent his final year of health quietly trying to make sure I was seen. I started keeping a folder. Not a metaphorical one, an actual physical accordion folder, the kind I use to organize my students' individualized reading plans, color-coded and labeled in my own handwriting because some habits from the classroom never leave you. Blue tabs for attorney correspondence, yellow for notarization logs, red for anything that directly contradicted the will we'd all been handed. In that leather chair. By December, the red tab was the thickest one in the folder. I hid it in my classroom. Not my apartment. My classroom, in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, behind a stack of construction paper, because it was the one place in my entire life my mother had never once set foot. She'd been invited to 3 separate school events over the years. She'd attended none of them. It was, I realized with a laugh, that came out closer to a sob, the safest room in my life, precisely because she'd never bothered to value it. If you've ever built something important in a space someone else dismissed as small, a spare room, a garage, a classroom nobody thought mattered, you understand exactly why that folder felt like armor. The hardest part wasn't the research, it was the dinners. My mother still expected me at the house every third Sunday, a tradition she maintained less out of affection and more, I now understood, out of the same instinct that made her stage open houses. Appearances required upkeep, and a daughter who never visited raised questions she didn't want asked. I sat at that table through November and December with a folder growing heavier in my classroom filing cabinet and said nothing, while Ryan talked about the acquisition. His firm was closing, and my mother asked me, in the tone she used for children and the elderly, whether my little school was doing all right this year. "It's not little," I said once, quietly, in November. "We have 412 students." She smiled the way she smiled at clients who pointed out a house's flaws. "Of course, sweetheart. I only meant it's sweet, what you do." I want to be honest with you about that word. Sweet. For 27 years, sweet had been the ceiling my mother built over my entire identity. Not talented, not capable, not building anything that mattered, just sweet. A word you use for things that are small and pleasant and require no further consideration. I used to accept that ceiling. That December, sitting at her table with a red-tabbed folder, waiting for me 40 minutes away, I let the words slide past me the way rain slides off a roof that's already been reinforced. I had started doing a different kind of math by then, not the arithmetic my mother had taught me. the one where my worth got divided by however much space Ryan needed in the room. A new arithmetic, one my father had apparently been doing in secret during the last year of his life. The kind where you stop asking to be counted and start counting the evidence instead. Ryan noticed something was different about me that Christmas, though he couldn't have said what. "You've been quiet lately," he told me in the kitchen, rinsing wine glasses while our mother held court in the living room. "Everything okay?" I almost told him. I want you to know that I almost handed him the whole truth right there over a sink full of dishes because some small, tired part of me still wanted my brother to be the person who chose to stand beside me instead of finding out in a courtroom. But I looked at him, comfortable in his tailored sweater, secure in a company he believed he'd earned honestly, and I understood that telling him now, before I had proof solid enough to survive his mother's version of events, would only get the evidence buried faster than Eleanor Voss's letter had found me. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired. End of semester." He believed me because believing the easy answer had always been easier for my family than asking the harder question. The breakthrough came on a Thursday in January, the kind of gray, sleeting evening that makes the records annex feel like the last building left standing in the world. I was 3 hours into microfiche when I found the notarization log entry that changed everything. A single signature, dated 11 days before my father's death, witnessed by a notary whose name I recognized because I'd seen it before, on Ryan's original inheritance paperwork, filed years earlier. The dates didn't match. The witnessed signature on Ryan's documents was dated a full 6 months after this notary's license had expired. I sat very still in that humming fluorescent room, the microfiche machine's fan the only sound, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the opposite of grief. Grief takes something from you. This gave something back. The first solid, undeniable proof that the story I'd built my entire adult life around might not be the true one at all. I photographed the log, my hands finally steady, and drove straight to Nathan's office, even though it was after 9 at night. He met me in the parking lot in his coat over pajama pants, because some calls you don't put off until morning. "Look," I said, holding my phone out to him under the streetlight, sleet collecting on both our shoulders. "Look at the date." He studied it for a long moment, and when he looked up at me, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen from anyone in my family in 18 years. Not pity, not the soft, dismissive fondness my mother reserved for things she'd already decided were small. Respect. "Chloe," he said, "I think we just found the crime." We didn't celebrate. That surprised me. Looking back, I'd expected some kind of release, the way you'd expect relief after finally solving a problem that had haunted you for years. Instead, Nathan drove us both to an all-night diner 2 blocks from his office, ordered black coffee for himself and hot tea for me because he'd noticed somewhere over the past 4 months that I never touched coffee after 6, and we spent the next 2 hours building a timeline on a paper placemat with a borrowed pen. "Expired notary licenses aren't uncommon on their own," he said, drawing a line across the placemat. "People forget to renew. It happens, but an expired license, used to witness a signature on inheritance paperwork, filed by the same family, 6 months after your father's death, that's not an accident. That's someone who needed a signature and didn't care whether the person providing it was still legally authorized to give one." "Who would even have access to something like that?" I asked. "A notary who'd let their license lapse and still agree to sign something?" "Someone desperate," Nathan said. "Or someone who was promised it wouldn't matter, because nobody was ever supposed to look this closely." He set the pen down and looked at me across the sticky diner table, the fluorescent light doing nothing kind for either of our exhausted faces. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer." Once we pull this thread all the way, there's no putting it back. Your mother, whatever her involvement turns out to be, this becomes public. It becomes permanent. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the leather chair, the $12,000, the word sweet, sliding off my mother's tongue like something she could apply and remove at will, the way she applied fresh paint to a listing before an open house. I thought about my father in the doorway of my classroom, hard hat dripping rain, telling me I'd built something brick by brick. I've been prepared for 18 years, I said. I just didn't know it yet. The notary's name was Harold Weiss. It took Nathan's investigator less than a week to locate him, retired now, living 2 hours north in a modest ranch house with a chain-link fence and a dog that barked itself hoarse the moment our car pulled into the driveway. He didn't want to talk to us. I understood why the second I saw his face through the screen door, the particular guarded fear of a man who has spent 18 years hoping nobody would ever come asking about a decision he made under pressure he didn't have the courage to refuse. I don't have anything to say, he told us through the screen, one hand still on the door, like he might close it any second. Mr. Weiss, Nathan said, calm as ever, we're not here to make trouble for you. We're here because a family's entire inheritance was built on paperwork that may have been fraudulently witnessed, and the woman standing beside me spent 18 years believing her father didn't love her because of it. I watched something crack in the old man's face. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to relief, the particular exhaustion of a secret that has finally outlived its usefulness. Come in, he said, but I'm not signing anything I don't understand first. We sat in his kitchen for 2 hours, his dog finally settling at his feet, while he told us, in a voice that kept catching, that a woman had come to him 11 days before James Harper's death. Not James himself. A woman, well-dressed, carrying documents that needed witnessing quickly, offering cash for the inconvenience of doing it same day. He hadn't asked many questions. His license had technically lapsed 4 months earlier, a paperwork oversight he'd meant to fix and never had, and he told himself it wouldn't matter for something this small. Did you know the woman's name? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Harold Weiss looked at me with something like an apology in his eyes. She gave her name as Linda, he said. Said she was handling arrangements for her husband, said it was urgent, that he wanted things settled before he got any weaker. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the street, ordinary and distant, the kind of sound that belongs to a world where nothing important is happening. I felt the particular cold stillness that comes when a suspicion you've been holding at arm's length finally steps close enough that you can't pretend it's still just a shape in the distance. Would you be willing to give a formal statement? Nathan asked gently. To provide the same account you just gave us, under oath, if it comes to that. Harold Weiss looked down at his dog, then back up at me, and something in his expression suggested he'd been waiting 18 years for someone to finally ask him the right question. Yes, he said, I would. If you've ever had a stranger hand you the missing piece of a puzzle you'd spent years assembling alone, you know, there's no word for that feeling that doesn't sound smaller than it actually is. Drop a comment if you've ever felt the ground shift beneath a story you'd built your whole identity around. I promise you, it's not the end of the story. It's usually where the real one finally starts. By February, the red tab in my accordion folder had grown so thick it no longer closed flat. Nathan and I had assembled a full evidentiary timeline. The March 14th trust restructuring consultation my mother had never disclosed. The expired notary license used on Ryan's inheritance paperwork, Harold Weiss's signed and sworn statement, and the piece that finally made Nathan sit back in his chair and exhale like a man setting down something heavy. A formal records request confirming that a probate case file bearing my father's case number had, in fact, been received by the courthouse archive 18 years ago and never entered into the official record. Someone had made it disappear. And for the first time, we had a paper trail wide enough to prove it. I filed the petition on a Tuesday in February during my lunch break, standing in the courthouse lobby in the same cardigan I'd worn to teach a lesson on fractions that morning. I remember thinking, as I signed my name at the bottom of the filing, that it was strange how ordinary the moment felt. No thunderclap, no dramatic music, just a clerk stamping a date on a form and sliding it into a tray, the same mechanical process that had, 18 years earlier, somehow let an entire truth vanish without anyone noticing. I called my mother that evening because Nathan insisted it was the right thing to do, legally and otherwise. Better she hear it from me than from a process server at her office. "I've filed a petition to reopen Dad's estate," I told her, my voice steadier than my hands. "There are some records I think the court needs to see." There was a long silence on the line, longer than I expected, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the warm, staged quality I'd heard my entire life. What replaced it was something colder, more careful. "Chloe," she said, "you have no idea what you're about to do to this family." I thought about the doorway of my classroom, the rain on my father's hard hat. Marcus finally sounding out the word mountain, while a man who loved me watched silently from 4 minutes away. "I think," I said, "I finally have a very clear idea." I hung up before she could answer. The lawsuit became public knowledge the way most things did in my mother's world. Not through an announcement, but through a leak, calculated and precise, designed to control the story before anyone else could. By the second week of March, someone at Harper Construction Group had told someone at the local business journal that James Harper's estranged daughter was suing the family over inheritance she'd never earned, and the story ran under a headline that made me sound like a stranger to my own name. "Teacher Sister Sue's Harper family claims hidden fortune." There was a photo of Ryan beside the article, taken at the company's anniversary gala, smiling in that easy way he had. There was no photo of me. I had, apparently, not been photographed enough over the past 18 years for anyone to have one on file. I read the article standing in the teacher's lounge during my planning period, coffee going cold in my hand, while 2 colleagues discussed lesson plans at the next table, utterly unaware that the woman 3 feet away from them was becoming a headline in real time. I remember the specific, dizzying sensation of watching my own life, narrated by someone who had gotten every fact half right and every truth completely wrong, and understanding, for the first time, exactly what my mother had spent 30 years doing to properties, to reputations, to her own daughter, staging the version that sold best, regardless of what was actually true underneath. My principal called me into her office that afternoon, not unkindly, just carefully. "I saw the article," she said. "I want you to know the school supports you, whatever's happening at home, but I also need to ask, is this going to affect your ability to be here for your students?" I thought about Marcus, 2 years graduated now, still sending me a card every September. I thought about the 6 kids in my reading club, the ones the district had quietly written off before I decided not to. "No," I told her. "If anything, it's reminded me why I do this job in the first place." She studied me for a long moment, the way people had started studying me lately, like I'd become a slightly different person than the one they'd known before. "You've changed since December," she said. "I don't mean that badly. You just seem—" She searched for the word. "Steadier." I didn't tell her about the accordion folder in my filing cabinet, growing thicker every week. I just thanked her and went back to my classroom, where a room full of 8-year-olds needed help understanding long division, blessedly unaware that their teacher had spent the morning reading about herself in the newspaper, as though she were a stranger. Ryan called me that night. I almost didn't answer. "What are you doing?" His voice had none of its usual polish. This was not courtroom Ryan, not gala Ryan. This was the voice I remembered from childhood, thin and frightened underneath the confidence, the voice of a boy who'd once cried in a closet during a thunderstorm and made me swear never to tell anyone. "I'm asking a court to look at documents I believe were concealed," I said. "That's all this is, Ryan. Documents. Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom, to the company? Investors are calling. Clients are asking questions. 20 years, Chloe, 20 years of Dad's legacy, and you're setting fire to it because—" His voice cracked, and I heard, underneath the anger, something that sounded almost like fear. "Because what? You feel left out?" "You've always felt left out. Ever since we were kids, you've made yourself the sad one, the forgotten one, and I have spent my entire life trying to make space for that. And now you're doing this?" I sat with the silence for a moment before I answered, because I wanted to make sure the next thing I said came from calculation and not from the old, familiar hurt that wanted to apologize simply for existing in a room he needed to feel comfortable in. "Ryan," I said, "did you know your inheritance paperwork was witnessed by a notary whose license had expired 6 months before he signed it?" The silence on his end of the line lasted long enough that I could hear his breathing change. "What are you talking about?" he said, and it wasn't a question anymore. It was a man beginning, for the first time, to do a different kind of arithmetic himself. "I have a sworn statement," I said. "From the notary. He says a woman came to him 11 days before Dad died, told him it was urgent, and paid him to witness documents even though he wasn't legally authorized to. He gave her name as Linda." "That's not—" Ryan started and stopped. I could hear him pacing on his end of the line, the particular sound of a man's certainty cracking in real time. "That doesn't mean anything. Notaries make mistakes on renewal paperwork all the time. That's not proof of anything." "Maybe not," I said. "But it's a thread, Ryan, and I've learned that threads, once you start pulling them, don't stop unraveling just because it's inconvenient for someone." He hung up without saying goodbye. It was the first time in 27 years my brother had ever hung up on me first, and I sat in my dark apartment afterward, phone still warm in my hand, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not guilt, clarity. If you've ever had a family member accuse you of making yourself the victim, right in the same breath where they're benefiting from the exact system that victimized you. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because I know exactly how disorienting it is. Drop a comment if you've ever been told your pain was actually just performance. I promise you, the people saying that are usually the ones who need you to keep believing it. The arithmetic moment, the real one, the one that changed everything about how I understood my entire family, happened on a Tuesday in late March, in the parking lot of a grocery store of all the unremarkable places. I had run into my mother by accident. She was coming out of the store with a single paper bag, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, and when she saw me, something in her face did the fast, practiced recalibration I'd watched her do 1,000 times with difficult clients. Assess, adjust, deploy the appropriate warmth. "Chloe," she said, walking toward me, "I've been meaning to call you." "Have you?" I said. Not a question, just a flat, tired statement. She reached out and touched my arm, the gesture she used on grieving widows during estate sales, practiced and gentle and utterly without weight. "I know this whole ordeal has been hard on you, on all of us, but I want you to know, whatever happens with the lawsuit, you'll always be my daughter." And there it was, the sentence that finally did it, not because it was cruel, but because of how effortlessly, automatically kind it sounded, the way a real estate listing sounds warm and inviting right up until you notice it never once mentions the foundation problems in the inspection report. "Mom," I said, "do you remember the first time I asked you to come to a school event? I was in 4th grade. I was reading the announcements over the intercom, and I asked you to come listen." She blinked, thrown by the shift. "Chloe, That was a long time ago. You told me you had a closing that morning, I said. I checked, years later. There was no closing that day. I found the listing. It didn't sell until the following month. I kept my voice level, the same voice I used with a student who needed to understand a hard truth without feeling attacked by it. I used to think you forgot. I used to think it was an accident, one bad day among 1,000 good ones. But I've spent the last 5 months reading through 18 years of documents, Mom, and I've started to understand something about how you allocate your attention. You don't forget things that matter to you. You've never once forgotten a closing, a commission, a listing appointment. You forgot me specifically, and only me, over and over again, for 27 years. My mother's face did something I had never seen it do before. Not anger, not her practiced warmth, something closer to exposure. The look of a woman who has spent her entire career controlling every room she's ever stood in, suddenly realizing the room has stopped responding to the performance. "That's not fair," she said, but her voice had lost its usual certainty. "No," I agreed. "It isn't. But I didn't come here to talk about fair. I came here to tell you I finally understand what I actually was to this family. I wasn't a daughter who disappointed you. I was infrastructure, something useful occasionally, but never worth investing in. The load-bearing wall nobody bothers to renovate because it's already doing its job holding everything else up." I felt my own voice steady in a way it had never been steady around her before. "You didn't need me to succeed. You needed me to be quiet and grateful, and small enough that Ryan's success looked bigger by comparison. And I let you build that for 18 years, because I thought if I just did the math right, if I was good enough, patient enough, undemanding enough, eventually you'd decide I was worth the investment too." "Chloe, I stopped doing that math in November," I said. "I'm not looking for you to validate me anymore, Mom. I'm looking for the truth. And I think, somewhere underneath everything you've built, you already know exactly what that truth is going to say about you." I walked to my car without waiting for her response. My hands were shaking by the time I got the door closed, not from fear, but from the strange, seismic relief of finally saying, out loud, a truth I'd spent a lifetime editing into something smaller and easier for everyone else to swallow. I didn't cry until I was 3 blocks away, stopped at a red light, and even then, it wasn't grief. It was something closer to the exhale after holding your breath for 18 years. Nathan noticed the change in me immediately when I brought him the parking lot conversation, recounting it word for word in his office 2 days later. "You didn't ask her a single question," he observed, leaning back in his chair. "In every prior conversation you've described to me, you've asked her something. Why, how could you, do you remember? This time, you didn't ask her anything. You just told her." "I'm done asking," I said. "I spent 18 years asking my family to explain themselves to me, hoping the explanation would finally make sense of why I mattered less. I don't need the explanation anymore. I have the documents. The documents don't need her permission to be true." Nathan smiled, the small, rare smile he allowed himself when a case turned a corner he'd been quietly hoping for. "That," he said, "is exactly the version of you that's going to win this case. Not the daughter looking for closure, the plaintiff who's already found it, and just needs the court to catch up." He slid a folder across the desk toward me. New evidence, gathered over the past 2 weeks, that I hadn't seen yet. Bank records. A private courier receipt, dated the week of my father's death, addressed to a courthouse archive facility with no corresponding entry in the official log. And beneath it, a single, handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age, sealed inside a plastic evidence sleeve. "Where did you find this?" I asked, my breath catching. "Eleanor Voss," Nathan said quietly. "She held on to it for 18 years, waiting for someone brave enough to come looking. She said she couldn't send everything in that first letter. She needed to know you'd actually follow the thread before she handed over the rest. I looked down at the handwriting on the sealed letter, familiar, unmistakable, the same slanted script that used to sign my report cards and hold my hand crossing parking lots and write "proud of you" in the margins of school projects I'd long since thrown away. My father's handwriting. "I think," Nathan said gently, "you should read that one alone, before you decide anything about the hearing next week." I held the sealed envelope in both hands, feeling its weight the way you feel the weight of something that's been waiting a very long time to finally be found. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I understood that the version of my father I'd grieved for 18 years, the one who supposedly hadn't thought I was worth much, had never actually existed at all. Someone had built him for me, and I was about to meet the real one. I read my father's letter alone, sitting on the floor of my apartment with my back against the couch, because some truths need you low to the ground before they can knock you over. The paper had gone soft with age, the ink slightly faded at the folds where it had been opened and closed, and I wondered how many times he must have reread it himself before deciding to seal it away for a daughter he wasn't sure would ever come looking. Chloe, if you're reading this, it means someone finally found what I couldn't get to you myself. I'm sorry for that. I want you to know I tried. 3 weeks ago, I sat with an attorney and changed my estate plan because I finally understood something I should have said out loud years earlier. You are the only one of my children who ever visited me because you wanted to see me, not because you wanted something from the visit. You sat with me twice in that hospital room, and both times you asked me questions about my life, not my company. Ryan came to talk about himself. You came to listen to me. I don't know if I ever told you that mattered. I should have told you every single day. I'm leaving you controlling interest in the company, not because I don't love Ryan, but because I trust you to build something with it the way I built it, brick by brick, with people who matter to you, not for the appearance of success. You've been doing that in your classroom for years, without anyone in this family noticing. I noticed. I noticed every single time. I don't know what your mother will do when she finds out. I love her, and I know that's complicated, and I know you'll have complicated feelings about that too. But I need you to know that whatever happens after I'm gone, this was my choice, made clearly, made with my whole mind, made because you earned it. Not through money, through showing up. Build something good, kiddo. You already know how. Dad, I don't know how long I sat on that floor. Long enough that the streetlights outside my window had come on by the time I finally moved. Long enough that my legs had gone numb beneath me. Long enough that I had cried every tear I think I'd been saving for 18 years and found, somehow, that there were still more underneath. I called Nathan at 11 that night. I'm ready, I told him. For the hearing, for all of it. I know, he said. I could hear it in your voice the moment you picked up. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in April, and I requested a substitute for my classroom for the first time all year, because I understood that whatever happened in courtroom 4B that day, I needed to be fully present for it, not divided between two lives anymore, but standing in just the one that mattered. My mother arrived with Alderman at her side, composed as ever, though I noticed something new in the way she held herself, a stiffness at the shoulders, a carefulness in her expression, like a woman walking across ice she'd stopped trusting. Ryan sat beside her, but not close to her, a small physical distance that spoke louder than anything he could have said. He hadn't called me again after our conversation in March, but he'd sent one text, 4 words long, that I'd read a dozen times since. I need to know. 2. Judge Amelia Foster took her seat, reviewed the filings before her with the unhurried focus of a woman who had learned long ago that rushing justice was its own kind of injustice, and nodded to Nathan. You may proceed, counsel. Nathan rose. He didn't reach for the folder first this time. He reached for me. Your Honor, Before we introduce further evidence, my client would like to make a statement. I stood, smoothing the front of my blazer, and walked to the podium with a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed until I actually needed it. I looked past my mother, past Ryan, past the gallery of business associates and neighbors who had come expecting a spectacle, and found Nathan's steady gaze instead, the way you find a fixed point on the horizon when everything else feels like it's moving. "My name is Chloe Harper," I said. "I'm a third-grade teacher." For 18 years, I believed my father didn't think I was worth investing in. I built an entire understanding of myself around that belief, around being the quiet daughter, the disappointing one, the one who got $12,000 and a pat on the head while my brother inherited a company. I want the court to understand that this case was never actually about money for me. It was about finding out whether the story I'd been told about my own father was true. I nodded to Nathan, who opened the folder and began entering evidence into the record. The March 14th Trust restructuring consultation, notarized and dated, that had never been disclosed to the original probate proceeding. The courthouse archive receipt showing a sealed case file received but never entered into official record. Harold Weiss's sworn statement, read aloud in the old man's own careful, apologetic language, describing a well-dressed woman who had given her name as Linda and paid him to witness documents he wasn't legally authorized to notarize. I watched my mother's face throughout, and I want to tell you honestly, I expected to feel triumphant. I had imagined this moment for months, rehearsed it in my head during long nights at the microfiche machine, and I had always imagined it would feel like winning. What it actually felt like was grief. The specific grief of watching someone you love confirm, piece by piece, exactly how far they were willing to go to keep you small. Nathan reached the final piece of evidence. The sealed probate packet Eleanor Voss had finally released in full, containing my father's original will, the trust amendment, 3 witness affidavits from the attorney who drafted it, and a notarized financial accounting showing the exact date the original documents had been received by the courthouse and the date. 3 days later, they had officially vanished from the record. "Your Honor," Nathan said, "the timeline is unambiguous. James Harper legally amended his estate 3 weeks before his death, naming his daughter Chloe as the controlling owner of Harper Construction Group. That amendment was properly filed. It was received by this courthouse, and within 72 hours, it disappeared from the official record, replaced by documents witnessed using an expired notary license, procured by a woman who identified herself, under oath testimony we have on record, as Linda Harper." The courtroom had gone completely silent, the particular stillness I remembered from the very first day, except this time there was no confidence left in my mother's posture to crack. She sat with her hands folded on the table, no longer circling her thumb, no longer performing composure. She simply looked, for the first time in my entire life, exactly her age. Judge Foster studied the evidence for a long, unhurried moment before she spoke, her voice carrying the particular weight of a judgment that has already been decided, delivered with the calm of someone who has seen enough deception in her courtroom to recognize the real thing when it finally surfaces. This court finds clear and convincing evidence that James Harper's estate was fraudulently altered following his death, through the concealment of a legally executed trust amendment and the use of falsely notarized documents. She looked directly at my mother as she continued. This court restores Chloe Harper's inheritance rights in full, in accordance with her father's original, properly executed estate plan. Additionally, given the evidence presented today, this court finds probable cause to refer this matter for criminal investigation into estate fraud, concealment of probate assets, and perjury. I heard, somewhere behind me in the gallery, a woman gasp. I didn't turn to look. I kept my eyes on the judge and then, slowly, on my mother, who had gone very still, the way a house goes still, right before it's condemned. Ryan found me in the courthouse hallway afterward, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his composure gone entirely. "I didn't know," he said, and his voice broke on the words in a way I'd never heard from my brother, not once in 27 years. Chloe, I swear to you, I didn't know any of this. I genuinely thought Dad just left you less because he wanted to. I never once thought to ask why. I never once thought it was strange. I just took what I was given and never questioned it, because questioning it would have meant admitting Mom might have... He stopped, pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes. I'm sorry. I don't know if that word is big enough for this, but I am. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and understood something I hadn't fully understood until that exact moment. Ryan wasn't the villain of my childhood. He was simply the version of us my mother had decided to invest in, the same way she'd decided not to invest in me. Not out of malice on his part, just the particular blindness of someone who has never had to question why the world kept handing him things easily. I didn't fight for the money, I told him, echoing words I hadn't planned to say, but that arrived, fully formed, the way true things sometimes do. I fought because Dad deserved the truth, and so did I. He nodded, unable to speak. And for the first time in either of our adult lives, my brother hugged me like he actually meant it. I didn't quit teaching. People ask me that constantly now. The interviews, the messages, the assumption that inheriting controlling interest in a construction company meant walking away from a classroom that paid a fraction of what that company was worth. I understand why they ask. I understand less why they're surprised by my answer. I appointed an independent board to oversee Harper Construction Group's daily operations, the same way my father had once built it, with people who cared about the work, not the appearance of success. I established a scholarship fund in his name for kids like Marcus, the ones the system quietly writes off before anyone bothers to ask why they're struggling. And every September, I still stand in my classroom doorway some mornings before the bell, thinking about a man in a yellow hard hat who watched me for 4 minutes and saw, apparently, everything that mattered. My mother's criminal case is still pending as I write this. I don't know yet what will happen to her, and I've stopped trying to predict it because I've learned something important over the past year. I don't need her account settled to know my own is finally correct. I used to believe love was something you earned through smallness, through being quiet, undemanding, easy to overlook. I know now that was never love at all. It was arithmetic, built by someone who needed the numbers to favor her, and I spent 18 years accepting a sum that was never actually true. If you've made it this far, and you've ever felt like a line item in your own family, like your worth got tallied up and rounded down by people who should have known better, I want you to hear the only lesson that actually mattered in all of this. Lies can survive for years, sometimes decades, propped up by everyone's willingness not to ask questions. But the truth only ever needs one person patient enough to go looking for it. I was patient for 18 years. It turned out, in the end, that was exactly long enough.